Welcome to Ask SME Anything. Your chance to ask the ITProTV subject matter experts questions live. Here's your host, Ronnie Wong.
All right, and welcome to Ask Me Anything, a show for us to actually be able, of course, so that you, the viewer, can interact with the SMEs right here at ITProTV. So remember that you get a chance to, of course, we'll ask those different questions that you want to, and the easiest way to do so, of course, is to just tweet with the hashtag AskSMeAnything, and that way that will get it into our queue to be able for us to be able to answer questions live if we can. And even if you don't have that question answered for you live, we'll try and get to it sometime during our weekly or daily activities that we can, and we'll make sure that we get back to you normally on Twitter is what we'll try and do. Okay, so today I have with us, of course, Mr. Mike Roderick. He's actually going to be our SME today. Mike, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, Ronnie, thanks. Good. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Doing great. Excited to see what kind of questions we got lined up for today.
All right. So before we get started here, let's kind of remember, Mike for us is our Microsoft server and Windows client expert in all things here. I always call him the Microsoft Kung Fu Master is what I call him. He seems to be able to pull knowledge out of the air on certain arcane Microsoft things that I don't even think about. So any type of Microsoft questions, those are kind of his specialty areas. But he's also, of course, talented and versed in other things in networking technology and security as well. And he even dabbles into programming a little bit. I don't think we'll throw a ton, but he does tend to love PowerShell, which I find odd.
I do like PowerShell, right?
Yeah.
It's a chance for me to kind of get the best of both worlds. I get to stay in my Windows environment, and I get to do a little scripting, almost programming, if you will.
Right, yeah, it kind of seems like that unusual environment here, right? Everything that we try to do to go into the GUI, Mike is now finding his affinity inside of the realm of PowerShell here, okay? So this is a great chance for us to be able to have him here as we continue to move through this episode, and we, of course, get to pose him questions. So the great thing, though, Mike, is are you ready for some questions?
I am. I'm excited to see what we've got.
Well, so let's go ahead and go to our very first question then that we have already submitted for us. So Jeremy goes ahead and asks us here, what is a managed service account? Now, Mike, this is kind of interesting for us here. So this seems to be more in the realm of server environments because in the client environment, we probably don't even think about anything like this, right?
No, we really don't. And it's a great question. It's something that I think a lot of people are not aware of. You know, when I talk to people about using service accounts and using what we call MSAs or managed service accounts, or probably even more correct would be group managed service accounts or GMSAs nowadays, they're not aware that they're available. It's something that was introduced back in Server 2012, was refined a little bit in Server 2012 R2, and it's of course available in Server 2016. I'm assuming it'll be available in 2019. Haven't really looked yet, but it's a really cool feature. And probably to explain what it is, real quick, let's just talk about what a service account is. And when we think about an application or a service that we've installed on a server, well, that application or that service needs to run under a user context, right? It needs to be able to access resources, the file system, for example, or the network, or a share on the network, or something like that. And so how does that application or that service do that? We assign a user account to it. We assign what's called a service account. And back in the day, prior to, say, 2012, as administrators, what we would do is we would create just a standard user account. Just like you create a user account for you or I would go in, and let's say I was installing SQL Server, I would create actually several user accounts, SQL Server service, the SQL agent service. I'd create these user accounts just like any other user, and then I would assign them to SQL. And then when SQL needs to run a scheduled task, right, it would use that SQL Server agent user account to do that. So I'd have to grant the appropriate permissions, or sometimes like with SQL, you would tell it what user account you wanted to use, and it would assign the appropriate permissions to that user account so it could function and do its job. The downside of this was the fact that they were just standard user accounts, which meant they had to follow the same password policy as every other user in my organization, right? Which meant now I have got service accounts that I've got one of two options. Let's say our password policy is change your password every 30 days. That means somebody has to remember to change that password for that SQL Server service account, or it fails, right? You're going to come in one day and your user is going to be calling you up, hey, my reports aren't running anymore. The scheduled task didn't fire last night. What the heck is going on? We go and we look and we realize that, oh, that user account's password expired. Nobody noticed because nobody logs in as that account. We're not getting any type of messages, hey, your password's going to expire in 10 days. You need to change it. So it just fails, right? And then we have to troubleshoot it, figure it out, and fix it afterwards. So what admins would do is, and Ronnie, you probably remember this, we would just set a long password and then choose the option password never expires.
Right.
Hey, that solves the problem. Now I don't have to worry about that service account ever failing because the password never expired. And setting the password to never expire, there's nothing bad that can happen with that, right?
Yeah, no. Well, who could actually think about an attack vector right there?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically saying, hey, bad guys, you have forever to attack this password because it's never going to change. So if it takes you a month, 2 months, a year to crack that password, that's okay because we'll still be using that same password. And if they compromise that service account, obviously they compromise the service, and who knows what could happen from there. So not the best option, but hey, we would set a really long password, try to make it really hard to counteract or to give us a little bit of a good feeling about what we were doing. Well, that's when Microsoft said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create something known as a managed service account. And what this is, it's a new object in Active Directory. You do have to update your schema. So you need at least one 2012 domain controller in your network to make sure your schema has the new definitions for this object. And when you created a managed service account, this object inherits from the computer class object. And we know that computer passwords are handled by the system. We don't manage them. Windows does it in the background. It changes it automatically depending on what our interval is, typically 30 days. It's all handled through the system. We don't ever have to worry about it. So because this group managed service account inherits from that computer class, password is now managed. Windows will manage that password for me. And that solves that problem of creating a service account and then having, it could be something, think about how many service accounts you might have across your network. Probably dozens and dozens of service accounts for all these different applications. IIS, Exchange, SQL, SharePoint, all of these run one, if not multiple service accounts. So it could be somebody's job just resetting those passwords. Now, we don't have to worry about that. Now, it is important to understand that there's really two types of group managed service accounts nowadays, or I should say two types of managed service accounts. 2012 introduced managed service accounts, and those were great, but there was one limitation. They could only be used on a single server. So if I had a SQL server, I could create a managed service account and use it on that SQL server. If I had a second SQL server, or in a farm of IIS servers, if I had a second server, I had to create a second managed service account for that particular server. They were separate accounts. I had a third, and so scalability became an issue with these because you couldn't share them across machines. And when we talk about like a server farm, like say we're doing load balancing for IIS, we want those machines to be exactly the same. I don't want to have to worry about giving 3 or 4, 10 different accounts access to a resource. It becomes administratively a little too much overhead. So in 2012 R2, Microsoft introduced what's known as Group Managed Service Accounts, or GMSAs. These were shareable. We could now store the password information in Active Directory, give the different servers access to that authentication information through a couple of commands in PowerShell, and now we can use that same managed service account across all the servers in a farm, for example. So they would all be using the same account, which made administratively a lot easier to deal with. Same concept. Windows manages the password. We don't have to do anything with it, but it was just now shareable. And when they did that, the original managed service accounts now become known as SMSAs, standalone, if I can say that, standalone managed service accounts, and then you have group managed service accounts. And it's all done with the same PowerShell commands. If you go and try to create a standalone managed service account, you'll see there are no commands for that. You can create group managed service accounts. So how do I create the old, not shareable one? When you use your group managed service account PowerShell command to create it, you would use a parameter restrict to single computer. And that would basically create a standalone managed service account. So that's what those are. They're just user accounts that Windows is going to manage the password for us, and we can use them for services so that we don't have to worry about services failing when those passwords expire.
Now, Mike, as a follow-up question, that great explanation that you've given us here, if there is this idea of using the group managed service account, you said that's per server? Is that, I should say that, per like physical server, and then all the services that are running on that? Or do I need to actually create multiple group managed service accounts, like one for each server that I'm running on that host?
That's a great question. Let's make sure we clear that up. I mean, you could. There's nothing that's going to prevent you from creating a single group managed service account and using it for multiple services on the same server. But typically, we're going to follow principle of least privilege. And that service account that I use for IIS needs different access than the service account that I use for SQL Server or Exchange. So rather than take one account and give it all the access for all the different services, I would create individual. I'd create a group managed service account for IIS that just has the permissions and rights to do whatever it is that that application pool or IIS needs. A separate one for SQL, 5 separate ones for SQL, right? One for the SQL Server service, one for the agent, all of those different things. Because again, we want to follow the principle of least privilege. If by chance somebody compromises one of those group managed service accounts, just like any other user account, they can be compromised. They are passwords. All passwords are crackable. So it could be compromised. I don't want them to be able to have keys to the kingdom, essentially, right? If they do compromise that one account, all they get access to is whatever that one account had access to, not everything.
Yeah, Mike, that's a great point to make. Sometimes we think about this idea of ease and functionality by saying, hey, group managed service accounts, they're great. They allow us to do all this and not worry about some of the things we were worried about in the past. But then if you're new at this, you say, all right, I'm going to set it for everything. And all of a sudden you realize you have just handed everybody keys to the kingdom and didn't even realize it. So you still have to follow those basic best practice principles, even with something like this, even though it actually helps ease a lot of the management that we do. It's still something that we have to be careful of, or we open up everything. Okay?
Absolutely.
So it's a great thing for us to think about, especially if we're new to working with group managed service accounts. So Mike, in this sense, you've given us a taste of what it's about. Where in our course library will we tend to find more information on group managed service accounts?
Great question. If you're setting up for the 2016, which would be the current MCSA exams, 70-412, Identity with Windows Server 2016 is going to be where we cover both standalone managed service accounts and group managed service accounts and service accounts in general. We talk about where I can create them, how to create, like you have to create a KDS root key that allows them to access that authentication information. We go over all of that in those courses there.
All right, that's a great thing for us to think about because there's plenty more information. So if you want to learn more about that, make sure you check that out inside of the ITProTV course library as well. Okay, Mike, there's another question that has also now popped up, so let's take a look at that one. So we're on a roll here. Joshua asks, why is there a minimum password age group policy setting? So, Mike, this is kind of, I would say, not really a question that seems to need to be answered, but obviously somebody has a question about it, talking about the idea of the minimum. So they're not talking about the entire password policy. So as he's looking at this, he's probably wondering, like, why does there have to be a minimum to be able to set what we're doing here?
Joshua, that's actually, I think, a good question, or it is a question that I get often, especially to new administrators, and they're working with their password policy. They want to configure their policy for their domain, make sure everything's safe and secure. And we always think about things like, hey, I want to make sure that user uses at least 8 characters for that password, so password length. We think about complexity. I want to make sure they're using a mixture of characters to make that password complex and therefore hopefully a little bit stronger. So those are pretty common settings that we see. But as you go through those password policy settings in your GPO, you do come to one that says minimum password age, right below maximum password age, I guess, depending on how you have it sorted, but right below maximum, which is by default 42. So every 42 days you have to change your password. Right below that, there's a minimum password age, and by default it's set to 1. And many people ask me this question: why is there a minimum password age? First, let's make sure we understand what that policy is going to do. When you set the minimum password age, what that means is, like I said, by default, it's 1 day. So, Ronnie, if you change your password right now, you won't be able to change your password again for 24 hours until the following day. And, that is one that most people go, why? What if Ronnie was changing his password and I was shoulder surfing and I saw what he changed his password to? Don't you want that user to be able to change their password again right then and there? So most people are like, why would you want a minimum password age? And the reason is, it's kind of funny. Our users are really good at figuring out ways around our settings that we try to enforce on them, right? Everybody has their favorite password. And when it comes time to change your password, we use settings like password history to make sure they don't reuse the same password. So if your password was blue and it's time to change your password, because of our group policy setting that says remember password history, and by default it's 24, it won't let you use blue again. You'll have to change it to something else, orange, red, pink, whatever the case may be. So users got smart. They said, well, wait a second. If it's remembering my passwords, I want to use my favorite password. I really like the password blue. It's easy for me to remember. What they will do is they will sit there and change their password 25 times in a row. Within a couple of minutes, they can reset their password 25 times to get around that password history and get back to their favorite password. Now, I'm using blue as an example. That would not be a good password, but just for simplicity's sake. But that's what they'll do. They'll change their password over and over and over and over again until it finally lets them change it back to blue, which now, in a sense, means they've never changed their password because they're right back to the same password it was when they started this process. So by saying there's a minimum password age, by saying you have to wait at least 1 day, now you've got to wait a day, change your password. Wait another day, change your password again. Wait another day. So if I'm remembering 24 passwords, it's going to take you 25 days to get back to blue. And if we're changing our password every 30 days, it's really only getting you 5 days with the password of blue.
True.
And you're going to have to start this process all over again. And the idea is if I play with those numbers, right, if we set it to remember 30 passwords and change your password every 30 days, or remember 31 passwords and change your password to every 30 days, like you get to the point where they can't cycle back to that same password. And that's the idea, and that's why we have that setting. It is one that I get a lot of people who wonder, why do I have a minimum? Doesn't seem to be a security thing. And it's not directly like a strong password or a long password, but it is indirectly because my users will figure out how to reuse the same password over and over again. And that's what that's supposed to stop.
Yeah, it's amazing the length that we will go to somehow figure out how to bypass whatever setting that we choose to be able to do.
Well, yeah,
it really is amazing.
If I change my password, I have to update my Post-it note that I keep on my screen here with my new password, and that's a problem.
No, but I mean, I find it amazing that the end user ability to go, all right, here's this policy. And they'll make sure that they figure out how they can do the best thing that they can to override that
I
in
don't
some
understand
other
it,
way.
Ronnie.
Yeah.
There's times where, a user that cannot figure out how to print their spreadsheet in landscape format,
Right.
but yet they've bypassed my security policy altogether. It's mind-boggling. But where there's a will, there's a way, and they share that information, and pretty soon all the users are going to be doing that. So hopefully this will help with that.
Yeah, the idea of group policy, right, helps us to enforce whatever policy that we've created, and it does it in a nice standard manner, and that's a good thing, right? We don't want it applying to some and not to others if we don't want to, but we, of course, can limit that by groups. But this is part of that overall group or the group policy for the password policies anyways. So in other words, it goes into a whole bunch of settings. A combination of them is what really makes it strong, and not just this one setting alone is what we want to remember as well. Okay, so Mike, that's actually a great place for us because that actually leads into apparently more Active Directory stuff
good.
now.
My favorite.
So let's take a look. So yeah, group policy is a big focus of Mike's, and now we're going to take a look here. All right, Mike. Some terminology that has actually updated in the last decade or so. I know.
Yeah.
For me, it's kind of, I say relatively new, but I'm not in Microsoft world as much as I used to be. Microsoft says to use IGDLA as the best practice for nesting groups. What does that mean? So here, Raymond is obviously probably studying for his first, let's say, server exam or Active Directory exam. And he's getting confused by some of the terminology here. So, Mike, help us out if we're just looking at it kind of like the first or second time, and he's like, I don't know why this is the proper structure. What's going on here?
This can definitely be a confusing one, Raymond, so don't feel bad about that. Make sure you check out our 70-742, right? That's the same one we were talking about just a minute ago, Identity and Server 2016. And this is where we'll cover this group nesting strategy. But let's talk about it. So IGDLA. The idea here is Microsoft says, we want you to follow best practices and use group nesting. And group nesting means I put one group inside another group. And I think at this point, if we're not, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Groups are used to simplify administration. If I have 50 salespeople, most likely all of those salespeople need access, the same type of access to multiple resources. rather than granting permissions individually to user accounts 50 times over and making my access control list long, we use groups to gather up users that have similar access requirements, and then I can assign the permissions to the group rather than the individual users, and it makes administration a lot easier. Again, we go into much more detail about that process in our show, so make sure you check those out. But when they talk about IGDLA, this is how Microsoft says we should use groups. And let's break that acronym down first. I is identities. G is for global groups. DL is for domain local groups. A is for access. So what Microsoft is saying is I want to take the identities. This would be your user accounts, your computer accounts. We're going to collect those up and put them into global groups. So IG, identities, go into global groups. And I like to draw little arrows right across the top of that acronym to kind of show it, if I'm doing this in a class. So identities go into global groups. Global groups gather up users that have the same requirements. So I've got a global group for sales. All my sales users are going to be in that group. I've got a separate global group for marketing. All my marketing users or identities would be in that particular global group. So you create these global groups based on roles within your organization, similar access requirements. Then we have domain local groups that we use to assign access, right? So we got identities into global groups, and if we skip for a second, access is given to domain local groups, right? So the domain local group might be something like sales reports full control or sales reports read, right? And I give the access to that domain local group. So when I go to that folder called sales reports, I'm going to assign the domain local group read permission, or I'm going to assign the domain local group full control. I'm giving access to the domain local group. Then I can take my global groups. Oh, all my sales users need read access. So I can simply take that group that has all my salespeople in it, dump it into the domain local group that's called sales reports read, and I'm done. I just gave all 50 salespeople read access. If the boss comes to me tomorrow and says, hey, you know what? Marketing needs read access to that stuff as well. I've already got a global group called marketing with all my marketing users in there. I've already got a domain local group that has read access to that folder of reports. So all I got to do is dump the global group into the domain local group nesting, and they have permissions. If I hire 10 new salespeople tomorrow, all I have to do is add them to the global group, and they're going to pick up all the permissions from all the group nesting we've already done. If Bob no longer works in sales and no longer needs access to that folder, I remove him from that sales group, that global group, and he no longer has that access. So by following group strategy and this group nesting strategy, administration of access to resources becomes a whole lot easier. And it's very tempting, especially in small organizations, to skip all this, right? I've only got 4 sales users. I'm just going to go to that folder and I'm going to add those 4 people to that access control list, and I'm done, right? But the problem is you plan on growing as a company, hopefully, right? You're not stagnant. You want to grow. You want to get bigger. 4 salespeople becomes 40 salespeople, becomes 400 salespeople. And now all of a sudden, adding them individually to an access control list is going to be a problem. It's going to be a lot of work. So if I follow this strategy early on, even I've worked in organizations that were very small, and I had a group where there was only one person in that group. Right? It would have been just much easier to add them directly to the access control list, but I knew that eventually there was going to be 2 people in that department or 3, right? And I want to be able to reuse these groups in different places, and it makes life for a whole lot easier. As other administrators come in and work with this, they don't have to know, oh, what is Ronnie's role in the organization? They'd look, oh, sales, right? That's it. Or hosts, SMEs, right? That's what Ronnie's role is because he's in that group. Well, they don't even have to think about it. They're just adding the hosts group to the domain local group. Doesn't matter who's in it to them. So it really simplifies administration. Now, Ronnie alluded to an interesting little trivia that it wasn't always IGDLA. That actually started, I want to say, Ronnie, 2008, somewhere around there, right. Maybe 2008 R2. It doesn't really matter. But for those of you that have been doing this for a little while will remember, this acronym is not new, or this thought process is not new,
right.
But the acronym is. It used to be AGDLP, right? And A stood for...
Access.
Accounts, right?
Oh,
yep.
Yeah, see,
and so I know, it's been so long. Accounts went into global groups went into domain local groups, and then domain local groups were given permissions.
Right.
So that was the P. With the advent of the cloud and things like that, accounts really, I think, was limiting, or
Right.
it didn't give you the right thought process, so they went with identities rather than accounts. And permissions, it's not always a permission that you're assigning. It could be a right or something else. So access is what they went with. You might be giving somebody remote access or the ability to VPN in, something like that. So not strictly permissions, I guess. So they changed up the wording a little bit to be a little more flexible, but it means the exact same thing. AGDLP, IGDLA, it's all the same. It's just different words. There's also one I'll throw in there for you. Sometimes we slip a U in there, Ronnie.
Right.
You remember
Universal?
what the U stood for?
Universal?
Universal. Universal groups come into play when you have multiple domains in your forest. So if you're a single domain shop, you really don't need universal groups. But if there's any chance of you ever growing, putting another domain in your forest, incorporating another business, bringing their network into yours, you might want to use the universal groups as well. And we slip that in between the global and the domain local, because universal groups allow me to collect, let's say I've got two domains. Well, in domain A, I've got a global group for salespeople, but in domain B, I've got a global group for salespeople. I want to assign all people access to that sales folder. So the strategy becomes IGUDLA. You take your identities, you put them into global groups in both domains. Then you take your global groups and put them into a single universal group, and then the universal group is added to the domain local group, which is given the access. Universal groups allow me to collect up global groups from multiple domains. So again, if you're in a single domain environment, universal groups really don't give you any advantage. But in multiple domains, global groups cannot contain members from other domains. So I can't gather up all the salespeople from all my domains. But what I can do is take global groups from each domain and put them in a universal group. So now I do have a way to gather up all the salespeople from all my domains. So it becomes IGUDLA, or in the old way of doing it, AGUDLP.
There's no doubt, Mike, that as we begin to study for this, if either it's because we've kind of come from like the pre-2008 world of Windows Server, or if we're studying it for the first time, it does get a little bit mind-boggling about how all this nesting and the groups end up working here. So this means if you are studying for that and you need to prepare for that, make sure you do check out that 742 episode or shows that are there that will help to prepare you and get you a little bit of a deeper understanding into that idea of those group nestings, because it's probably a big part of that exam as well. So make sure you check that out too. All right, Mike, they are rolling in now. So we have another question that is ready for you right away as well. Okay. So Rylan asks, someone converted a security group to a distribution group. I converted it back, but the group no longer has the same access. Okay. And he asked a very relevant question. Why? All right, so here it is. I've seen this before where this has happened, where somebody went in, they took a look at a group, and they started, of course, like the way that I do. You move the mouse around, like, okay, oh, those are right. And they accidentally went from the security group, and they clicked on the distribution group and clicked OK and saved it, and now permissions are gone. What's happened, Mike?
Yeah, this is a common one. This is easy to do, as you said, by mistake, or you have an admin that says, all the users in sales, I've already got a global group, a security group for sales that has all my salespeople in it. I sure would like to email everybody in sales. I'll just change that group to a distribution group so that I can do that, right? So I can email everybody in there, because that's what a distribution group is. Distribution group, when we create groups in Active Directory, there's really two types of groups I can create: security and distribution. Distribution groups are used for email applications, so that I can email everybody in the group, used along like with Exchange, things like that. Security groups are used to assign permissions. The problem is we have to think about the fact that a security group is a type of security principal, right? A security principal is anything that I can add to an access control list. A security principal gets assigned a security identifier, that unique number that's made up of your domain identifier and a relative identifier that uniquely identifies that object. So when I add it to an access control list, I can uniquely identify it. I can say that group has this permission or denied this permission, whatever it is we're doing. Distribution groups do not get a security identifier, right? They're not used for security. I cannot add them to access control lists. So what has probably happened is you've had a group like sales, and it's been added to a whole bunch of domain local groups, and now somebody's converted to a distribution group. Here's what happens. When you add a group to an access control list, or when you nest a group, you see the word sales or the name of the group, whatever that may be. What the system sees is the SID, right? That's how it knows the group. It displays the name sales just because we're humans. And I don't like to see S-1-5-9- blah, 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 blah. I don't know what that is. But I do know what sales managers is or whatever the group might be called. But really what's being stored is the SID. So as soon as you convert that to a distribution group, guess what happens?
It's gone.
We strip that SID from that group. It's no longer a security group. It doesn't get an SID. So it removes that SID, which means that group is no longer in any of those other access control lists or other groups because it can't be. It doesn't have an SID. It breaks that tie between that security identifier and that group. You can convert it back to a security group. And guess what? It'll get an SID again, but it's not going to be the same SID. It's going to regenerate a brand new SID. It goes, oh, here's a new security principle. Let me create an SID and slap it on that group. It doesn't go, oh, this group used to have an SID. Let me reuse that one. SIDs are never, ever, ever reused. Once you converted that to a distribution group, that SID was removed and it was destroyed and it won't be used again. No matter if you create new ones or you try to reassign one, it's not going to happen, all right? So that becomes the problem. You realized your mistake, you accidentally clicked distribution, you clicked OK or apply, and you go, oh no, I wasn't supposed to do that. You change it back real quick and hope nobody's going to notice. The problem is it's got a brand new SID, so to the system, it's a brand new group, right? And you're going to have to go and add it to all the places it needs to be added all over again. There's no quick fix for that. You're going to have to redo that. So the word of caution of the day is don't convert it to a distribution group unless you don't plan on using it as a security group.
All right, so Mike, that ends up adding in a follow-up question to that. So if we wanted to do exactly what you were mentioning at the beginning when you were answering here, that, hey, that security group has all the people I really do want to send emails to, do I create just a second distribution group with the same identical members? Is that what I do?
You know, there's two schools of thought, I think, to that. I have seen people say create a shadow group, create your distribution group and make sure all the same members are in that distribution group. The problem is it sounds fancy. It's like, ooh, a shadow group. That sounds cool. It's very manual. I had to look at the one group and add the people into the other group. And if I add somebody to this security group, it doesn't automatically add them to this shadow group. It's just a distribution group.
Right.
So you got to manually do that. So you can do that, right? If that's the way you want to do it, that's fine. Or you can email enable the security group. The cool thing about security groups, while distribution groups can only be used for email, security groups can be used for security as well as email. So I can assign an email address to the security group, and if I send an email to that email address, sales@ITPro.TV, it'll go to everybody in that group. So the better, I think, me personally, the way I would rather do it is email enable my security group rather than create a separate distribution group and try to manage the membership for both of those groups.
Yeah, I agree with you. I just want to make sure that as we brought that up, because I have seen some of those strange structures inside of Active Directory when you start seeing that, like, why are there two groups that are named almost the same? And then you realize when you click on, oh, this one's a distribution group, this one's a security group. And so the idea of email enabling, I would do the same thing instead. I think that's the better way to go.
I think so. There could be a chance that some emails get doubled up. Like if you're doing some group nesting, let's say I've got a sales managers group and I've got a sales group and I've added the sales managers group to the sales group. Or if somehow, and maybe a user is in both for some reason, I could see a scenario where maybe they get more than one copy of the email or something like that. Or for some reason, you want to have a distribution group of sales, but not all of the sales. Maybe your sales group contains all of your salespeople, but sometimes you want to just enable email, I don't know, the salespeople that sit in Gainesville, not the salespeople that sit in Tallahassee. I don't know. So maybe a distribution group separate from the security group would give you that flexibility. So really, either way works. Just depends on what you need to do.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Mike, that all these are considerations here. But as we start to think that helps us, at least if we're preparing for the exam, to make sure that we understand and that we get the separation and the idea here. Okay. So, Mike, again, my follow-up question: when we start taking a look at it in our course library, where will we tend to find a little bit more information on this?
Again, I'm going to point you right back to the same one. This is the 70-742. Everybody out there has been watching my show this week, and they're asking questions for that one.
Great.
I don't know.
No, that's great. All right. So, Mike, this brings us up to we're running a little bit on the edge of time here, but it
Okay.
brings us to our last question that we have ready and queued up here. So, Seth asks, "What is domain functional level?" Okay. So, Mike, this is one of those settings in which not everybody tends to change very often, but the very fact it's there, and there are questions like, "What is it? What does it do for us?"
That's a great question, and you're right. It is one that sometimes goes unnoticed until you need it, and that's when you're like, "Wait, what? What? Why can't I do this?" Oh, because my functional level is not correct. Yeah, and really, what you need to think about here is every time Microsoft comes out with a new version. When we went from 2008 to 2008 R2, we went from 8 R2 to 2012 to 2012 R2. Each time we got new features and new capabilities. 2012 did things that 2008 R2 couldn't do. Otherwise, we'd just still have 2008 R2, right? We're adding new features, new capabilities. For example, group managed service accounts came out, or not group managed, but managed service accounts came out in 2012. That's something 2008 didn't know, didn't understand. And so our functional levels determine what features are available to Active Directory. And here's what you have to think about. One, functional levels can be at the forest level, and they can also be at the domain level. We have domain functional level, which our question was asking, and we also have forest functional level. So let's start with domain. Within my domain, we have more than one domain controller, right? Hopefully, right? We don't want a single point of failure or anything like that. Your functional level is determined by the operating system running on your domain controllers, not your member servers, just your domain controllers, the lowest operating system of your domain controllers. For example, if you had 3 domain controllers, one of them was running 2008 R2, the other 2 are running 2016. Well, your domain functional level has to remain at 2008 R2 because you have that older domain controller that's not going to understand any of those features that 2016 brings to the table. So you cannot raise your domain functional level until you upgrade that domain controller. If you upgrade that domain controller to 2016, now you can raise your domain functional level to 2016 and take advantage of all those cool new features that 2016 brings to the table. So your functional level is determined by the lowest operating system on your domain controllers within that domain. All right? Forest functional level is determined by the lowest domain. So if you have 3 domains, one domain is at 2012 R2 functional level, one domain is at 2016 domain functional level, one domain is at 2008 R2 functional level, your forest can only be as high as the lowest domain. So your forest would have to remain at 2008 R2 functional level. What you would have to do is go to that domain, upgrade all your domain controllers, raise the domain functional level, do that to all of the domains within your forest, then you can raise the forest functional level. So the forest functional level is determined by your lowest domain functional level. And it's all about features. Now, one thing I do want to say with this, because I get people asking me this, should I raise my domain functional level? We've upgraded our domain controllers from 2012 and 2012 R2. We've upgraded them all to 2016. Do I need to raise my domain functional level to 2016? Here's what you want to keep in mind, or here's what you want to think about when you're making that decision. What features does it bring, and do I need to take advantage of them? Because here's something to consider. Once you raise that domain functional level, let's say I raise it to 2016 domain functional level, I can no longer introduce any domain controllers less than that. I can't add a 2012 R2 domain controller because my domain functional level is too high. That domain controller can't be added. And that might be a problem. You might be merging networks, and they've got 2012 domain controllers, and you need to merge them in and bring them into your domain, and you can't. Now I need to go buy some licenses to do some upgrades because I've set that functional level too high to merge those networks together. So, and sometimes the new functional levels don't really bring anything exciting to the table. And so at that point, the only thing you're doing by raising the functional level is limiting what you can do. And maybe that's what you want to do, right? Maybe you want to make sure nobody introduces a 2012 domain to your forest or a 2012 domain controller to your domain. Maybe that's okay. But just keep that in mind. Once you raise that domain functional level or that forest functional level, that becomes the bar. And everything else has to be at the bar or higher from then on. And they did change this. You can roll back some of these functional levels. It's something relatively new. I'm old school, and I will tell you that I learned never, ever try to do that. Do not change. It used to be a one-way street, and you couldn't roll it back. There are certain scenarios that will, like if it hasn't replicated or if you haven't done a couple of things, you might be able to roll that functional level back. That sounds like a nightmare to me. It just sounds like it would introduce some problems that I don't want to deal with. So I would avoid that at all costs. Join me. Let's take a look at my screen here, just real quick. This is just Microsoft Docs, and they've got forest and domain functional levels, and it's just a chart or a document that shows you some of the features. Like here, it shows me with 2016 forest functional level, you get everything that was available at 2012 R2 plus the following features. Privileged access management using Microsoft Identity Manager. Sounds great. But if that's not something that I plan on using, then I probably wouldn't raise my functional level. I would leave it at 2012 R2. Because here's the thing. If I ever need this, I can simply go in and raise my functional level. But in the meantime, if we needed to introduce a new test domain, or we bought a new company and we're merging their domain into our forest and they're still running 2012 R2, I haven't ruined it yet, right? So I'm not going to raise my forest functional level until I know I need this particular feature. So that's what I would recommend is if you're going to raise your domain functional level, if you're going to raise your forest functional level, or you're thinking about it, go look and see what features it brings. See if they warrant doing that, because just understand you're setting that bar.
There's no doubt, Mike, that these are considerations that we do have to think about as we start working with the idea here of Windows Server, because we don't. Sometimes we go, all right, well, of course we want the newest. We want the latest thing that's out there, and we want to do that. And we don't think about the idea that we may still have other ones that have some backward compatibility that we have to worry about as well. But these are great things for us to consider as we continue to moving forward with working with Windows as well as with our certifications too.
Yeah, it's an easy one to do. Oh, I forgot that that domain control at the branch office is running an older operating system, and and it would fail, or it wouldn't let me raise it because of that. But those are the things you have to consider.
Yeah, it's all great things for us to actually consider as we start doing this. So it's something else that especially on that one, because I don't remember the last time where somebody said we've got to raise this until there was a new feature that was needed. But for me, it's always just been whatever that level's been. We just kind of left it alone. But Mike, thank you again for joining us today on Ask Me Anything. It's been a pleasure. You heard all the great wisdom here from our Microsoft Kung Fu Master, as I call him right here at ITProTV Studios as well. Okay, so that will kind of help us out here as we end that portion. But we do want to remind you of a couple of different things that are coming up on our calendar here at ITProTV as well. Okay, we have a couple of webinars as of September 13th. We'll be doing a webinar on the idea of DASS, right? DASS, realities and rumors here. And I'll be presenting on that particular topic. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the idea of desktop as a service and what are rumors surrounding and what are the realities that we have to worry about when it comes to the future. The following week after that, on the 20th, I want to make sure I tell you the right date as we select that. Yep. We're also talking about DevOps blunders. And, of course, that will be Don Pizzette and Justin Dennison. Both of those guys in the DevOps world will help us out with that and probably have a few good laughs there, too, as they're, presenting on that as well. So there's a lot of material right there for you to go ahead and sign up for and register for and get yourself more immersed and more into contact with some of the SMEs here at ITProTV. But that about wraps it up for us here today as well. Don't forget, if you are submitting questions, go ahead and continue to submit them with Ask Me Anything, and that will put it into the queue, and we'll make sure that we try and get them answered to you back at Twitter. But remember that if you're a member here at ITProTV, we'll probably also answer them in the forums as well. So, of course, members get that first opportunity, and we'll make sure that we do provide those answers that come in from our members right there in our forums, because that's probably the most easy way for us to be able to gain access to that and to give the answers that we want in full-length detail right there as well. But for us right here at Ask Me Anything, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Are you enjoying Ask Me Anything? Then be sure to check out our other podcast, TechNado, where we take a look at the most interesting tech news stories from the week and interviews from people in the industry. Here's the latest episode, and here's the full playlist. And as always, be sure to subscribe to ITProTV's channel.
ITProTV.